On the 9th of August 1812, the coffin of Thomas Chase was slowly carried down the steep steps to his family vault at Christchurch Parish Church in Barbados. Aside from the workers paid to carry his coffin into the family vault, there were no mourners present. No one was mourning the death of a slave owner, whose ruthlessness and cruel brutality was the embodiment of the evil of slavery in the 19th century. His daughter, Dorcas Chase, had been laid to rest in the same vault only a month before. The brutality of her father had driven her to commit suicide through the painful and agonizing process of starving herself to death. The workers slowly pushed aside the heavy stone slab that had been cemented in place, concealing the entrance to the tomb. Finally, the slab was moved, and as light filled the burial vault, the workers released a collective gasp of fear at what they saw. Some said quiet prayers to themselves, others stared in silent disbelief and terror. Something was very wrong. Each of the 3 coffins contained in the vault had moved. One of the coffins was on its side. Another coffin, that of a baby, had been moved to the corner of the vault, where it was now placed upside down. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry. The coffins were placed back in their original positions and the tomb resealed. But this was just the start of what would become one of the most terrifying and unexplained cases in the history of Barbados. The incident was largely forgotten about until 4 years later, on the 25th of September 1816, the tomb would be opened again to receive the body of an 11-month-old Samuel Brewster Ames. Once again, the vault was in disarray. There were 4 coffins in the vault, including the coffin of Thomas Chase. They were strewn all over the floor of the vault. After the first incident, it was assumed that vengeful Bayesians were somehow responsible for the desecration of the vault. But the apparent ease with which the incredibly heavy, lead-encased casket of Thomas Chase, which had taken 8 men to move, had been thrown, meant that a force far more powerful and dangerous than mere humans was responsible. The coffins were placed back to their previous positions, and the tomb resealed. It wouldn't be long until the vault would be reopened. 7 weeks later, when the coffin of Samuel Brewster was carried to the tomb, the sight that met those present was one of utter carnage. Not only were the coffins thrown around like wood chippings, but the wooden coffin of Mrs. Thomasina Goddard had been thrown with such force that it had broken into planks. Whatever force was responsible for the disturbances was getting more powerful, and evidently more violent. The planks of Mrs. Goddard's coffin were tied back together with wire and placed against a wall, and the vault was once again resealed. The significance of the year cannot be overstated. April 1816 was Barbados' only ever slave rebellion. Samuel Brewster, the man being buried, was killed in the uprising. The rebellion was led by a man named as Busa. It culminated in Busa leading a force of approximately 400 men and women into battle at Bailey's plantation on Tuesday, the 16th of April. The revolt ultimately failed, and Busa's forces were defeated in battle. Busa himself was killed in action. Following the failed revolt, 214 were executed, 170 were exiled, and countless more were mutilated for their part, directly or indirectly, in the insurrection. On July 1819, the coffin of Mrs. Thomasina Clark was carried to the vault in a cedar coffin. The workers set about unsealing the vault and chipped away at the cement that was holding the door in place. But this time, something was different. The slab refused to move. The workers continued to chip at the cement until there was no cement left, yet still the slab didn't budge. There was something holding the slab in place. The fear and trepidation were palpable, but the workers put their fears to the back of their minds. When they finally pushed the slab aside, they froze when they saw what it was. The huge leaden coffin of Thomas Crane, that needed 8 men to move, had been launched 6 feet across the vault and was wedged up against the door. It was as if something was trying to throw Thomas Crane through the door and out of the tomb. Other coffins had been disturbed, but the coffin of Thomas Crane bore the brunt of the violence. The only untouched coffin was a previously demolished and now wire-bound coffin of Mrs. Goddard. The mountain hysteria regarding the phenomena had prompted the governor, Lord Combermere, to be present to see the disturbances for himself. He had hoped that the stories had been exaggerated, or there was at least one obvious explanation. But as he watched the workers struggle to move the immense weight of Thomas Crane's coffin, he realised the stories were all too real. Not only were the stories real, but the phenomena seemed completely inexplicable. How did a coffin that needed 8 grown men to move fly 6 feet across the vault with enough force to jam it against a door that had been sealed with concrete? He led his men into the vault, determined to find an answer, and ordered an exhaustive search. They checked every inch of the floor for trapdoors, and tried each brick to see if there were any loose enough to remove, and inspected the floor for water damage. This was in line with one theory that flooding could account for the movement of the coffins, but found there was no way anyone could have found a way into the tomb. There were no signs of water damage or flooding, nor was there an entrance for floodwater to enter. Unwilling to admit defeat, he ordered that the floor be sprinkled with sand before resealing the tomb. If anyone was responsible, this would show footprints, and would be washed away if flooding was responsible. As an added measure, Lord Combermere used his private seal on the concrete that sealed the door to the vault. This ensured the door couldn't be opened and resealed without obvious signs of damage. The coffin of Mrs. Thomasina Clarke would be the last coffin laid to rest in the vault. But there would be one final twist in the story. It was the 18th of April 1820, and Lord Combermere was entertaining guests at his home when the conversation turned to the now infamous vault. It had been 8 months since the burial of Thomasina Clarke. He was initially reluctant, but after some cajoling from his guests and the ever-growing sense of curiosity, he relented and agreed to see if the measure he had taken all those months ago had been effective. He was quietly confident that the deterrent he put in place, in the form of his private seal and the sand on the floor, would either dissuade whoever was responsible or provide an earthly and rational explanation for the phenomena. When they reached the vault, they checked the cement sealing the door shut and verified that the cement was undisturbed and that Lord Combermere's seal was intact. The 2 masons in the group broke this concrete seal and opened the door. The group stood and looked down into the dark opening to the vault, talking amongst themselves with a mix of excitement, intrigue, and apprehension. The first sign that something was wrong was when someone leading the group nearly tripped over a child's coffin that now lay in the steps leading down into the tomb. The sight that greeted them when they reached the tomb was a now familiar scene of chaos and disruption. Thomas Crane's coffin, the target of the most violent disturbances, was now upside down. Like the time before, the only coffin of Mrs. Goddard's was untouched. When they inspected the sand, it was completely unmarked. There were no footprints or even drag marks to indicate how the child's coffin had been moved from the vault to the stairs. This was the final straw for Lord Combermere, who ordered the coffins to be removed from the vault and buried somewhere else. From that point onwards, the tomb remained empty. So how do we explain the phenomena that had taken place in the vault? One of the most common explanations is flooding, but this doesn't explain why the sand was unmoved, and if flooding were severe enough to move the heaviest coffin in the vault, that of Thomas Crane's, it would most certainly have moved Mrs. Goddard's, but her coffin was untouched, following its destruction. Furthermore, there were no reports of flooding in the area at the time. Another popular theory is that vengeful Bajans, local to the area, knew some of the secret entrances to the tomb, but the absence of footprints in the sand following the final exhumation of the tomb seems to rule this out as well. A recent theory is that the whole story was an elaborate hoax, perpetuated by Lord Combermere himself. He came to the island in 1817 in response to the slave uprising in 1816. In addition to being tasked with keeping the slaves and locals under control, he was keen to outlaw the practice of obeah. The practice of obeah had significant cultural and societal significance to the Bajans. Obeah men and women, which the British regarded as little more than witch doctors, were highly influential. It was felt that by outlawing the practice of obeah, they could also reduce the influence of obeah leaders who spoke out against British rule and slavery. Lord Combermere could have fabricated the story to show the power of obeah, and that it is a real and present and potent threat that needed to be eradicated. White British Christians already had a deep suspicion and fear of the practice, so he could have tried to exploit these to push forward his own agenda. The problem with this theory is that the coffins were moving before Lord Combermere had set foot on the island. There would also be additional accounts of coffins moving in burial vaults across Barbados that had no involvement with the Lord Combermere. One of the most famous being the vault of Alexander Irvine, buried in 1841 in the St. Michael's Cathedral churchyard, a completely different location to the Chase vault. A little over 100 years later, Masons were investigating Irvine's burial place, and they discovered that not only had the coffins moved, one large lead coffin, that of Sir Evan MacGregor, was now stood up against the wall, but the coffin of Alexander Irvine himself had disappeared. When they searched the tomb, all that remained was a skull and a few bones resting on a ledge at the far end of the vault, which they assumed to be those of Alexander Irvine. Some claim that the timing of the disturbances could provide an explanation. The British government outlawed the slave trade in 1807, but the practice of owning slaves wasn't made illegal until 1833. Bajan slaves expected emancipation following the outlaw of the slave trade, and when this didn't happen, their anger culminated in the ultimately failed insurrection of April 1816. The disturbances in the vault weren't reported until after 1807, and it is telling that the coffin that was the main target was that of a slave owner. Were the vengeful spirits of slaves responsible, protesting at the continuation of slavery in Barbados from beyond the grave? This ties into the practice of obeah, which incorporates sorcery, which includes the summoning of malevolent spirits known as duppies to do the bidding of an obeah man or woman. Others claim that an unknown evil resides in the tomb, and it will attach itself to anyone who sets foot there. The locals talk of a story of an English family who removed a stone from the vault and brought it home with them. They were subjected to continuous poltergeist activity, which only stopped when they returned the stolen artefact. To this day, there has never been a plausible explanation for what was happening in the Chase burial vault. It seems that the mystery of the moving coffins of Barbados will remain unexplained.